Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today for another economic update from Dr. Eiler. As always, please use the chat feature if you have any questions, and Dr. Eiler will address them at the end of the webinar. Dr. Eiler, it's all yours.
Thanks, Vicki, and thanks everybody for coming. And as always, thanks to Shaven Concepts and Kaiser Marston for sponsoring this and having me continue these for y'all. So we are in a new year, and that new year has new foci, if you will, for economists to watch in watching the data come out for the end of the year and trying to figure out what's next. We've had kind of a roller coaster ride here for the last couple of months, culminating in the last few weeks. And thus now economists are waiting to see what the new administration is actually going to be able to pull off with respect to general economic policy. We've seen a flurry of executive orders, some of which are funding related, but most of the big ticket items are going to have to go through Congress. Something that did go through Congress was another round of fiscal stimulus. Even though we waited a little while versus our original expectations, checks are starting to show up at home. What that does is it sort of signals whether or not we actually are going to be able to use the second round of stimulus as the final bridge over troubled water, or we will have to do a third round of stimulus. And if you combine those two images together, economists are very concerned about what a third round of stimulus would look like. There's a lot of rumblings out of the Biden White House about what the composition of that will be. And then if there will be an investment package on the other side. We will come back to all that combination later. We are also waiting to see the efficacy and the generalization in the use of vaccines that are available. And it's been an amazing scientific ride in terms of watching science try to solve this problem. Now we as society need to help solve the problem. And we seem like we're hearing good things about the vaccine generally. But until we really see case loads go down, and we feel like that we're not going to have any more restrictive social policy. Today, for example, Governor Newsom is supposed to start lifting some of the regional constraints that were originally put on in December as so-called stay-at-home orders. That needs to stay away, and we need to get businesses back to work and people hired again before we really feel like we've turned the corner and basically utilize the original economic momentum coming into summer last year and beyond. However, as we'll talk about a little bit later as well, we are seeing differential effects of the lingering recession on certain portions of our economy, specifically low-wage workers. And so we've seen an increase in social services demand. We've seen an increase in food bank demand as people are making marginal decisions about staying in their home, putting food on the table, and remaining in their car, as the case may be, in terms of having an option for transportation. So all those together are sort of what economists are looking at thematically. In terms of the data for December or through December 2020, here are the national numbers. And I've showed these in past webinars, but here's the idea here. I'm going to show you the way in which people become unemployed. So in the United States, generally speaking, recessions are typified by the loss of jobs in a permanent way, meaning that you get released from work and there's no idea that you're going to come back to that same job. Well, this recession was typified by temporary job loss. And you can see that on the far right-hand side. Not much action. These data are monthly from January 2007 forward to just last month. You can see that big spike in temporary job loss. Well, this is permanent job loss in comparison. And now you can easily see the Great Recession on the left-hand side of the graph. And you can start to see the evolution of the unemployed on the right-hand side, where the bulk of the people who lose their job generally in recession are temporary job loss and permanent job loss. Now those permanent job losses are starting to creep up in higher volume. And the trick is, and we don't know this very easily yet, it'll be 6 or 9 months before we really know this, is how much of the reduction in temporary job loss has now become permanent job loss versus getting jobs back. And you can kind of surmise that from the evolution of the labor data, but it's not a perfect matching in terms of, okay, how many of these folks that were in the gray area are in now the blue area versus getting their jobs back. You have to kind of back into that data. The other way people become unemployed is that they complete a temporary job and don't find another job yet. They choose to walk away. They re-enter the labor force. And this is a big one in terms of whether or not this is parents who had to stay home with kids and are now looking to get back to work, but their original job is no longer there, versus just people who were out of the labor force generally and now want to try to come back in, and the new entrants, which are generally high school graduates and college graduates. So you add all those up, that rainbow look on the right-hand side unfortunately means that we are growing the unemployed in ways that are classic recession reasons. What we really wanted to see was the bulk of those gray area jobs get back to work and not turn into the other portions of the unemployed that are related to job loss otherwise. One way we try to track what's going to happen with job loss is the continued claims for unemployment insurance. What these data really are the net flow of people on and off of unemployment insurance. So I'm going to show you this for the US and for California to give you a contrast about the path that both these areas have been on. This is from January 2020 through the end of December. And this is the US data, or these are the US data. So you can see it spike in May and then slide down with a very steady gradient all the way down to about the end of November, and then things started to flatten out. Well, the labor data for December suggests that the US the American economy's original momentum in the labor market started to slow down in November, and these data sort of saw forward that was going to happen. That flattening and that little baby hook at the very far right-hand side suggests that we are also going to see lingering effects into January and potentially February as well. So we really need to get this black line to move as close down to zero as possible. In California, it looks like this in contrast, very similar shape over the last 3 or 4 months, really wild start in terms of the way people came on and off of unemployment insurance in California, given, again, that graph we just looked at, temporary job loss converted to permanent job loss, very long flat period, and then things started to get better. The point is, we do not want to see a curl back up, given that we've had this nice slope down towards zero. We really need to keep that momentum going. These data at least suggest that the momentum is there. We just might have a little bit of a flat period for right now. But as I said earlier, if we don't get those vaccines generalized and we don't get the business confidence around the idea that we're going to have the social restrictions lifted and be able to get back to work per normal, that flattening period might last a little longer. Okay, so now I'm going to show you the recovery momentum in terms of looking at the industry level at the US, at the national level. And here's April. So April was the original bad month in terms of job loss. And it's a little tricky when you look at this graph because those don't look dramatically big. But if you look at the left-hand axis and see that some of these blue bars are actually close to 50%, which means versus April 2019, with respect to food services and drinking places, which are basically bars and restaurants, almost half the people who were working April 19 did not have a job April 2020. But as I showed you in the data before, we saw recovery momentum. This is November, so we saw some really nice get back in terms of jobs, people getting back to work, but still relatively large numbers. And you can see accommodation on the far right-hand side, which are hotels and anywhere you can stay overnight, did not recover as much. So our travel industries are still under a lot of duress, and a lot of our low-wage workers are in those last 3 categories. And that's why, as we'll see in a minute, a lot of the damage that might still linger for some time to come is unfortunately going to be borne by our lower wage workers. And this is December, so you can see a little bit of give back in these areas. 32% of the people that had a job 1 year ago in hotels and motels are out of work in December 2020. About 1/5, 1 out of 5 still in bars and restaurants. So that's a lot of workers out of work. And a lot of the concentration of this is in our urban areas because of people not coming into the urban areas for work. Now, I'm going to show you this graph, which is the so-called a recovery comparison, where we're going to look at the Great Recession and how jobs came back to the American economy versus this recession. You're going to see some maybe at least kind of eye-popping changes. Here's the Great Recession. So economists believe that the recession started November 2007 in terms of job loss. It was dated slightly earlier than that, but the point is you can easily see using the red dotted line as the marker of when things started. The blue line starts off relatively flat, drops precipitously, bottoms out about 24 to 30 months later, then starts to slowly increase. And it took 77 months for the American economy to go from the beginning of job loss to getting just back to that same volume of workers. Now, that's the Great Recession. Long period of time. We know it was a tough time. Here is COVID-19 in contrast. So in the last 12 months, this is the evolution of jobs starting in January 2020. Same sort of locking the same idea where this is really about percentage change in jobs. This is the so-called V shape, and now it's starting to curl. That curl is problematic. We want that black line to move up to the red dotted line, just like in the continued claims for unemployment insurance graph, we wanted the black line representing US net change and continued claims to move down towards zero. Same basic labor market dynamic. This just suggests, again, that we had good recovery momentum that's starting to flatten out a little bit. Let's look about California, or let's talk now about California. So in California, we have seen unemployment rates rise across the board. We saw more people come on to unemployment insurance. We saw a little higher contraction than we expected in the labor force. But the bottom line is, if you look at that bottom row, the unemployment rate has gone back up again. So we were just about 7% in California, and now we're back up at 9. I'm sorry, we were just about 8%. Now we're back up at 9. And other places like, let's say, San Francisco, San Diego, Sacramento, which were surging back toward full recovery, have now flattened out and slowed down. A lot of that is because the number of people who are out of work increased, which makes sense, but it's also at the same time an increase in the number of people who are now looking for work. Remember, I showed you that graph earlier. We saw that sort of slowly creeping increase in the number of people re-entering the labor force that not have a job yet. That is also affecting our regional areas in California. Now, bottom line, California, just like the US, has seen some flattening over the last month or so, really about the last couple of months. And the key is whether or not we start to turn the corner in January and February permanently toward full recovery, or are we going to have this sort of flat wobbling period around the same amount of workers and really not getting any net growth? That's the real challenge. And it's very much predicated upon the idea of not having full social restrictions anymore and ultimately having business confidence pick up. Okay, same graph we looked at with the US, except I'm not going to show you November this time. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not going to show you just April, November, and December. I'm going to show you the entire recovery period and hopefully the continued recovery period from April forward. So this is for California by industry. Here's April, kind of similar look in terms of the state level and the US level. Oh, Vicki, you need to mute, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So if you look at these job losses, you'll notice that the leisure and hospitality, bars, restaurants, and hotels, very similar contraction in jobs to the US level. Other services, hair salons, nail salons, nonprofits that don't have anything to do with healthcare, a lot of different services like fitness centers where you're relatively close to the client. Well, here's May, June, July, August, September, October. Now let me stop there. We had a lot of recovery momentum starting to build up in the national economy. All these data corroborate what we saw before, but now you're looking at it industrially. You can see a bunch of the other industries really started to creep closer back to no change from the previous year, month by month. But in leisure and hospitality, other services, we started to see that creep up that not as much momentum, I'm sorry, as we saw in other industries. Same thing at the US level, those lower wage workers suffering more than other workers throughout those industries. Here's November and December. Same deal. California, we saw some give back in terms of that recovery. And in those lower wage industries, we're losing that momentum again. So we got to turn the corner. And really what it is, it underscores the idea that we've got to get these businesses back open, but we got to get people traveling again. A lot of the leisure and hospitality losses are because of the lack of demand and the lack of forecasted demand for travel. And all of these losses, because now you're getting these successive month on month non-recovery against the previous year, business losses have got to be baked in here somewhere. Now I'm going to show you some data about California in a minute that suggests what's going on with business closures, but there's some caveats, and it's very tricky to track that generally. But really why I'm showing you all these labor data is not only because these are really the best sort of real-time data we have. The other piece is just simply we're trying to track what we think are good indicators about business loss. Here's continued claims at the regional level. Here's California, same graph I basically showed you now on a monthly versus weekly basis. Here's San Francisco, coming back a little stronger, but had a lot higher surge in the number of people going on to unemployment insurance versus where they started January 2019. That shows you that long flat period where not much changed, and that's why I add the year 2019 here. Here's Sacramento, LA, San Diego, Fresno, Sacramento, again, for some reason, and then the US. So you can see that across California, there was really not a whole lot of change in terms of the let's say, beginnings of the recession until about September. And then most of the regions of California took off, but that dotted line, the US, you can see was basically peaked quickly and then had a nice steady gradient. Other states remained open, sort of played around with social policy, did not necessarily follow the California model. There was not really a national model, as we know, but all of them are now starting to show a little bit flatter movement than we expected. In terms of continued momentum, we really need to have all these curl down hard over the next 2 or 3 months. We will see. But what these data should tell us is where the labor market is going, just like we saw earlier with the US and California overall on a weekly basis. Okay, so let's stop there briefly in 30 seconds. The labor market momentum has slowed. It does not mean it has stopped. We are not on the precipice of a double dip recession. However, if we don't have those vaccines work well and we don't have business confidence and thus hiring kick back in, we are going to have a relatively weird flat period probably for the first quarter of 2021 and hopefully no farther than that. But for right now, we really got to turn some corners in terms of truly seeing social policy lifted, because the numbers and the science tell us it's time, and we have the availability to do so. One bright spot that continues is housing. So this is the housing forecast from Zillow looking forward 1 year as of December. And these are by metropolitan statistical area, or basically sort of the larger areas in California with respect to the geography that sort of splits the state up, even though some of these are relatively small population wise. You can see here that the percentage change between December 2020 and December 21 as forecasted is positive across the state. Most of them over 10% growth in median home price, which is pretty amazing. But the key here is just thinking why. Lower interest rates, people moving from rental to home buying, people leaving the state, increasing the number of units that are available, but having so much demand that it really outpaces supply. Those are the basic components of why we're seeing this. Now, the opportunity cost, of course, of having this kind of housing growth is that we're going to start talking about housing lack of affordability again, as soon as we finally get through the recession and into the recovery phase in full. Here's another look at that so-called K-shaped recovery, where we have high wage workers who basically recovered. These data are just through October, and there's a project at Harvard University in partnership with the Gates Foundation that's called tracktherecovery.org that has an enormous amount of big data sources that they're using to put these data together. But this is the split. In California, by the end of October, high wage workers, those that earn at least $60,000 a year, had basically come back to the original level that was hired at the beginning of January. But low wage workers were almost 28% lower than the level they were at in January 2020. So that split is really what is the picture of a so-called K-shaped recovery that was talked about during the presidential campaigns. And it's an issue for social services, for our municipalities, and really just to keep our low wage workers steady and stable in California going forward. We need to close that gap soon. And you can see here is the high and the low. And the key is not pressuring local government, not pressuring nonprofits, not pressuring apartment rentals and really the vacancy rates that can change housing markets quickly, and getting businesses back in the cycle once they go, rather than scrambling around looking for workers. Now, I alluded to the idea that we would look quickly at a small business, or let's say a business closure data point. That's what this is. These are for businesses that have less than 500 workers, I'm sorry, but most of these in California are really under 25 workers. Maybe in leisure and hospitality, half the businesses that were open in January 2020 are currently closed at the end of December. Now, what we don't know about those closures, and this is a critical factor, we don't know whether or not they are permanently closed or temporarily closed. And you can see that gap is not that big a deal versus overall businesses and leisure and hospitality, where most of the pain has remained in terms of a lack of recovery. But we're worried about that fade and how that hurts local areas in terms of, even in wine country in California, we're worried about tasting rooms. We're also just worried about hotel demand. And what's going to happen when people start coming back? Are we going to see a contraction of hotels that's going to lead to quick prices rising? Or we're going to have people scrambling around? And what's it going to take on the cost side to keep these businesses open? That's really one of the biggest issues looking forward, is how does it change business costs? Well, the Biden administration does have an economic plan that's meant to help small business and help a lot of different things across the economy. Here's what has been put forward. And this is, each one of these I've done. We usually talk about economic development in some way, shape, or form. Well, economic development is going to be affected by what comes forward, not only through executive orders, which are relatively short term in theory, versus what Congress is going to pass or not. So here we go. First, we know that there's an emergency plan in terms of short term spending. We're going to see more checks coming. You should expect another round of stimulus at this point. The Biden administration wants to provide health insurance coverage for 97% of Americans in 10 years. We will see if that gets through Congress in terms of moving that ball forward. It'll be intriguing to see how that gets pushed back in time with respect to these other priorities. Expect taxes are going to go up. Now, they want to push the top tax rate closer to where we were before the Trump administration came in, and including the corporate tax rate. We will see. A lot of it is really about reallocating, with the idea that there's some other things coming up, like they want to forgive student loan debt. Well, that's a huge bill for the federal government to come up with, which is ultimately going to be borne by taxpayers. And looking to make college free for those making $125,000 or less is also going to be a big bill. Now, there's a great investment on the other side of that, but we're going to have to see whether or not Congress has the stomach to spend that kind of money with respect to school, and what strings are going to be on students if that happens. They want to raise the minimum wage. There's an enormous amount of left of the aisle pressure to get something like this done. We'll see if the Biden White House can get this done, given the Republicans' resistance and also some of the Democrats who may not want to see as sharp a raise against small business costs as sort of very left Democrats and some independents want to see. There's going to be a lot of stirring around about trying to get subsidies, not necessarily be protectionist directly with, they're going to want to get rid of some of the tariffs, but they're also going to want to subsidize manufacturing as best they can. But almost every single president in my lifetime has had this as a focus, but has struggled to figure out the economics of how that's going to work. And then also an investment in clean energy. There was a lot of discussion during the Biden campaign about a Green New Deal. They're putting this number out as $2 trillion spent on investment, and really on investment in research and design and development around trying to start entrepreneurship in green energy once and for all. We will see if all that comes forward. But these are the big tenets of the economic plan that the Biden administration is starting to push out in terms of details. So watch for these coming forward and how that might affect your local area. So what should we be watching? I get a lot of questions about lower interest rate, or how low interest rates are, and if they're going to continue. The answer is they should continue until we really feel like we've turned the corner and economic growth is starting to show its face without a question. The one thing to watch is how fiscal spending increases pressure on interest rates, given we're basically paying for that through debt. Home prices, this is a big thing to watch. As I showed you earlier, there's a really strong forecast still in place, but if that plays out, we may see that sort of shifting around the state a little bit, even though I have a hypothesis that once we're clear of this issue and everybody gets vaccinated who's going to get vaccinated, and we feel like the cases have fallen down, our urban areas are going to start being vibrant again, and a lot of our employers are going to ask people to come back to work. We will see. That should keep things stable in most of our urban areas with respect to home prices. That K-shape versus V-shape recovery. Originally, we thought we would see a bounce back of everybody, but because we're still seeing suffering in those low wage areas, that's a concern, especially in our urban areas where lower wage workers tend to concentrate, providing services for both the professional services that are in those urban areas and also tourists. We've got to watch and see how that moves forward, because it's starting to play out in terms of rental vacancy, in terms of social issues and social services demand. We really need to get those folks back to work. That's going to lead into public sector issues. So we are also hearing rumblings that the Biden White House is going to try to get more funding to states, counties, and cities. Again, whether or not Congress has the stomach to spend that kind of money to fill some gaps is an open question. We'll see if that plays out. But if it does, that's going to help a lot. The state budget is not necessarily relying on that anymore. And we saw a relatively strong budget come out of the governor's office from what we thought was going to be, but there's still deficit spending inside of that budget, for better or for worse. And they have to figure out how they're going to close that gap. Big challenge, folks, and this is the thing to think about as far as where the economic forecast is going. In everything I said, especially in terms of where we started this webinar with respect to what the federal government's going to do, it's all about managing debt. We have to be able to move through this recession without undermining confidence in global investors with respect to our debt. Most economists think that there's not going to be that big of a deal, but it's something to watch going forward as we build up more and more debt. And the questions in Congress around how much is too much. We had these same questions in 2009. We got through it. The global financial markets purchased our debt like crazy, and we are in a low interest rate time in which financing these things through debt, deficits through debt, I should say, is relatively inexpensive given what it could be. But watch for that going forward in terms of putting the brakes on some of these ideas that the Biden White House has come forward with in terms of how they're going to approach getting us through into the recovery period in full. Great. Well, with that, folks, thanks again for coming. I'm going to ask Vicki to facilitate the question period. I see there's some questions in the chat. Vicki, if you're there, let me know.
Okay, I am here. So Trudy is asking, do we know if the government is issuing debit cards instead of checks for the stimulus?
I think that they are in terms of how they've enhanced specific government assistance like SNAP and food stamps and those kind of things. But I don't think that they're sending debit cards instead of checks. I'm not sure about that. I think it's still coming in check form for the most part.
Okay.
But again, I mean, either way, that, you know, in theory, both those are cash equivalents. The issue is if for our more senior folks who are going to receive that money, if that turns into a you know, what an economist would call a transactions cost for them, and now they got to figure out how they're going to use that debit card rather than just getting the check and putting it in the bank.
Okay. And Sarah asked, do you think that the fraud associated with unemployment claims in California affects the data and projections you've discussed today?
They shouldn't, in the sense that they all seem to be corroborating each other. The fraud is always there. There's always some amount of fraud, and it might have picked up a little bit, but we're not hearing any rumblings out of EDD that it's generally undermining the data that are reported and its connection to the broader labor market indicators that we just looked at. We should expect some of that to continue, unfortunately, but it shouldn't be at such a high level that it's undermining our ability to use those data in terms of making decisions.
And Leslie is asking what is the effect of the latest stimulus might have on the stock market?
Well, what it should do is it should provide continued confidence that the federal government is willing to spend money. They're willing to prop up the lower income level folks and keep consumption moving, which then feeds revenues for the larger players in our major indices. And it's kind of a dubious aspect of this is that because our stock market is currently being driven by 6 to 10 major companies, the more that you use fiscal stimulus to basically prop up the revenues for those businesses, it does drive equity values up, but the equity values are rising for folks who are in the market. If those low-wage workers are spending most of what they receive and not saving some of that, their ability to take advantage of those rising equity prices is a little bit tricky. So it's kind of a funny dichotomy in terms of how equity markets react to fiscal policy, where that fiscal policy is positive for certain socioeconomic groups, but those socioeconomic groups may not themselves be able to also get the advantage of wealth ascension that would come from rising stock prices driven by that fiscal policy.
Okay. And Lisa asks what the effect of the stopping the pipeline construction and no drilling permits on federal land.
It's going to slow down employment probably in the middle of our country, and it'll be intriguing to see if there's any transition there where there's a lot of discussion in Congress about part of the game is going to be if you want to spend this money, you got to get that pipeline back open. That's assume that we're going to see the middle of our country suffer a little bit with that closure.
And I think one last question, and I apologize if you haven't looked at these numbers, but have you seen consumer spending increase, decrease? What direction is it going?
Well, consumer spending is up. How much of it is a function of consumer confidence slowly rising, or just simply that Congress through the Treasury and through the President's office are basically pushing more money towards people and they're spending that money that they wouldn't have spent otherwise, is an open question. And decomposing that, if you will, is a little bit of a trick that economists are going to do probably over the next 12 or 18 months in mass, because it's a great research topic. But consumer spending is up. Whether it's up for the right reasons or not is really the next big thing. So if we don't see labor market recovery, when we see spending going up, it's mainly driven by outside forces that are there just because we're still not turning the corner in recovery, which is not a great foundation upon which consumer spending is happening.
Okay. I think we are at time in a minute. I'd like to thank everybody again. And look forward to the next webinar, and watch the website and emails, and we'll send you out a notice on the new dates. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.